Rosie has always been good at disappearing. Not the dramatic kind. Not the kind where you pack a bag at midnight and leave a note on the kitchen table. The quiet kind. The kind where you shrink yourself so small, so carefully, so completely, that the people who hurt you simply stop being able to find you. She'd had 3 years of practice, 3 years of waking up in a different city, in a small apartment with second-hand furniture and a window that looked out onto a gray street, and telling herself that this was fine. That this was good, actually, that she had built something here, something small and steady and entirely her own, and that it didn't matter that the foundation of it had been laid on the rubble of the worst night of her life. She had a job she was good at. She had friends who didn't ask too many questions. She had a routine that held her together on the mornings when the ache in her chest felt less like an old wound and more like something that had never quite healed right. She had learned, slowly and painfully and with considerable effort, how not to think about him. Most days, it worked. Most days. She was standing at her kitchen counter when the knock came. It was late. It was raining. The kind of gray, relentless autumn rain that turned the streets into mirrors and made the whole city feel like it was underwater. She had a mug of tea going cold beside her, and a book she wasn't really reading open on the counter, and she'd been standing there for 10 minutes doing nothing at all. Which was a habit she'd developed and couldn't seem to break, this standing and staring and not thinking. The knock was quiet. That was the first thing that registered, how quiet it was. Not urgent. Not the sharp, demanding knock of someone who expected to be let in, just 3 soft, uncertain sounds against the wood, like whoever was on the other side wasn't entirely sure they had the right to be there. Rosie set down her mug. She crossed the small living room. She put her hand on the door handle. She opened it. For a moment, her mind went completely and utterly blank. He was soaked through. That was the first thing she actually processed, the purely practical, almost absurd detail that his dark hair was plastered to his forehead, and his shirt was translucent with rain, and there was a puddle forming at his feet on her welcome mat. He must have been standing out there for some time, long enough for the rain to have worked its way through whatever it was that made him seem impenetrable, which had always seemed like a lot. He was also, and this was the part that her mind kept sliding off of and refusing to hold, on his knees. Not standing, not leaning against the doorframe with that particular brand of casual authority he carried like a second skin. On his knees, on her doorstep, in the rain, looking up at her with an expression she had never in 3 years of trying been able to imagine on his face. He looked wrecked. He looked like a man who had traveled a very long way and arrived too late, and knew it. He looked like someone had taken everything that made Calum Ashford terrifying and stripped it down to nothing, and what was left underneath was this. Just a man. Just a man on his knees in the rain, looking at her like she was the last thing standing between him and something he couldn't name. For a long moment, neither of them said anything. The rain fell. The wind moved through the street behind him, sent a scatter of leaves across the pavement. Somewhere down the road a car passed, its headlights sweeping across them briefly, and then gone. Rosie was the one who finally spoke. "You look terrible," she said. Her voice came out remarkably steady given that her hands were shaking. Something moved through his expression, not quite a smile, something older than a smile, something that knew it had no right to be a smile and was trying its best anyway. "I know," he said. His voice was rougher than she remembered, lower like something had scraped the edges off it. She should have closed the door. She knew that. She knew it with the part of her that had spent 3 years carefully, deliberately constructing a life that didn't have him in it. The part of her that had cried in the shower for 6 months and then decided, quietly and furiously, that she was finished crying. The part of her that had packed everything she had and driven away and not looked back. Not once. Because she knew if she looked back, she would stop. She should close the door. She should say his name, say it flatly, say it like it meant nothing, and then close the door and go back to her cold tea and her unread book and her perfectly constructed silence. She didn't close the door. "What are you doing here, Calum?" she said instead. He looked at her for a moment, and she could see him choosing his words, which was unusual. Calum Ashford had never, in all the years she'd known him, had to choose his words. He'd always spoken like a man who knew exactly what he thought and had decided you would hear it whether you wanted to or not. The man on her doorstep was not that man. Or he was, but he was also something else. Something newer. And worse. And more honest. "I made a mistake," he said. The words landed in the space between them like something dropped from a great height. Rosie looked at him. She looked at the rain running down his face, at the way his jaw was set and his hands were loose at his sides, open, which was not a posture she had ever associated with him. She looked at him for a long time. 3 years is a long time to decide that, she said finally. "I know," he said again. She stepped back from the door, not all the way. Just enough. "You're going to ruin my floor," she said. He stood up. Slowly, like a man who had been on his knees for longer than she knew about, and not just tonight. He crossed the threshold. She closed the door behind him. She didn't offer him a towel immediately. She stood in the middle of her living room and watched him drip on her floor and tried to locate somewhere inside herself the thing she'd been carefully building for 3 years. The distance, the careful numbness, the armor she had constructed piece by piece out of time and stubbornness, and the sheer bloody-minded decision not to fall apart again. She could feel it. Still, it was there. But it was thinner than she'd expected. 3 years of maintenance, and one soaking wet man on her doorstep had made it feel like paper. She went to the linen cupboard and came back with a towel. She held it out without crossing the distance between them. He took it. His fingers brushed hers for just a moment. Not deliberately, just the ordinary physics of passing something from one person to another, and she felt it anyway. Felt it the way you feel a needle when you've been very carefully not thinking about the needle. "Thank you," he said. She crossed her arms. She had learned to do this, cross her arms and stand her ground and not move toward him, which had always been the instinct. Had always been the first and most powerful thing her body wanted to do when he was in the same room. 3 years ago, she'd made the mistake of following that instinct. She knew better now. "You could have called," she said. "Would you have answered?" She didn't say anything to that, because the answer was no, and they both knew it, and there was nothing to be gained from saying it out loud. He was looking around her apartment with the expression of someone trying to learn something from a room, taking in the small kitchen, the books stacked on every flat surface, the 2 plants on the windowsill that she'd kept alive against considerable odds, the evidence of a life assembled from scratch, from nothing, from the specific wreckage he had made of her. "It suits you," he said. His voice was quiet. She couldn't entirely read it. She wasn't sure if that was a compliment or an observation or something else entirely, and she wasn't sure it mattered. "What do you want, Calum?" she said. He turned back to look at her. The towel was hanging from his hand, mostly unused. He was still soaked. He would probably be soaked for quite some time. She had a brief traitorous thought about whether she should offer him dry clothes and then buried it immediately. "I want to explain," he said. "There's nothing to explain." Her voice stayed even. She was proud of that. She'd rehearsed this conversation in her head more times than she could count, in the early months, in the dark, when sleep wouldn't come and her mind kept running through everything she should have said, everything she'd wanted to say. She'd had 3 years to prepare. She was ready. I was there. I know what happened. You know what you saw, he said. There's a difference. She almost laughed. She felt the laugh rise in her throat and then die there because it wasn't really a laugh, it was something sharper and more painful than a laugh, and she didn't want to give it to him. I saw you, she said, very carefully, tell the entire court that I wasn't your mate. That the bond was a mistake, that whatever had happened between us was something you intended to have formally dissolved. I was standing right there. I heard every word. He didn't flinch. She'd expected him to flinch. He held her gaze with an expression that she couldn't name, something that looked almost like punishment, like he was making himself look directly at the worst thing he'd ever done and not look away. Yes, he said. You did. So what is there to explain? He was quiet for a moment. Why? He said finally. She looked at him. You know what? She said. And there it was, the first crack, the first small fracture in the evenness of her voice. You know that I don't know why. That's the part I never understood. That's the part I spent 6 months trying to understand and eventually had to stop thinking about, because it was going to eat me alive if I didn't. I know, he said, and I'm sorry. Don't, she said sharply. Rosie, don't apologize. Not yet, not before I understand. He crossed the room then, not to her, not all the way. He stopped far enough away that she could have stepped back, could have created more distance. She didn't step back. She wasn't sure why. Her arms were still crossed and her chin was up and her whole body was a wall. But she didn't step back. 3 years ago, he said slowly, carefully, like each word was something he was carrying very gently, there were 7 members of my council who knew about the bond. 3 of them had the authority to dissolve it without my consent, if they could demonstrate that I was compromised. He paused. Compromised was the word they used. What they meant was that a mate bond with an unmated Omega from a small province with no political standing was a threat to every alliance they'd spent years constructing. She stared at him. They came to me the morning of the announcement, he continued. They told me that if I confirmed the bond publicly, they would challenge it legally, and they would win. And in the process of winning, they would destroy everything you had. Your family's standing, your pack's territory, your mother's house, everything silence. He looked at her steadily. So I destroyed it myself, he said. Before they could. Rosie stood very still. The rain was still falling outside. She could hear it against the windows. You let me think, she said slowly, that you had rejected me. Because you chose to, because I wasn't enough. You let me believe that for 3 years. Yes, he said. She turned away from him. She went to the window and stood there with her back to him and her hand flat against the glass and the rain running down the other side. You should have told me, she said, very quietly. I know, he said. She heard him behind her, not moving, just standing. It didn't make it better, she said, knowing why. No, he agreed. But it changed the shape of it. She hadn't expected that. She hadn't expected that knowing why would reach inside the hurt and rearrange it into something that still ached, but ached differently. Like the difference between a wound and a scar. She didn't turn around for a long time. She made tea. She wasn't sure what else to do with herself, and the kettle was something to do with her hands, something practical and ordinary that didn't require her to look at him or decide anything. She heard him pull out a chair at her small kitchen table, heard the wet fabric of his shirt against the wood. She focused on the kettle. She made 2 cups, which told her something about herself she wasn't entirely ready to examine, and set them on the table and sat down across from him and wrapped her hands around her mug and looked at the steam rising from it rather than at his face. How did you find me? She said. It wasn't hard, he said. And then, after a pause, "That's not true. It took 8 months. Your tracks were very good." She felt a complicated mix of satisfaction and something softer, something she pushed down immediately. "I didn't want to be found. I know. Then why did you look?" He was quiet for long enough that she finally looked up. He was watching her with that expression again, the one that didn't have a name, the one that was too many things at once to be a single word. "Because I couldn't stop," he said simply. She looked back down at her mug. "You had 3 years," she said. "After whatever immediate threat your counsel posed, you had 3 years to come to me. To explain. To find some other way to handle it that wasn't just leaving me to think I was unwanted." "Yes, why now? What changed?" He curled his hands around his own mug. His hands were large. She remembered his hands. She remembered very specifically and at considerable inconvenience to herself the way his hands felt, and she was not going to think about that right now. "My counsel," he said. "3 of the 7 who came to me that morning. They're gone now." "Gone, removed," he said. "It took time. It took more time than it should have, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. The political structure I inherited was not one that could be dismantled quickly without consequences for everyone depending on its stability." He paused. "That's not an excuse. I'm telling you the timeline, not asking you to accept it as a justification." She studied him. "You dismantled them for me?" "I dismantled them because they were wrong," he said. "And because they had done what they did to you, and to me, and to the bond. And because I wanted to be able to come here and tell you the truth without putting everything you loved in danger." There was a silence. The rain had softened slightly outside, shifted from a downpour to something steadier and quieter. "You knelt," she said. "Yes, outside my door. In the rain." "Yes." She shook her head very slightly. "Not in disbelief, exactly. More in the way you shake your head when something confirms a thing you'd been afraid to hope was true." "Calum Ashford," she said. "Alpha King of 4 provinces, commander of the Ashford armies, the man who once made a visiting duke cry simply by being in the same room as him." He looked at her steadily, on his knees in the rain outside a second-hand furnished apartment in a city that isn't even on the main trade routes. "Yes," he said. "What were you going to do if I hadn't opened the door?" He was quiet for a moment. "Stay," he said. She stared at him. "I was going to stay," he said simply. "Until you did, however long that took." She opened her mouth, closed it, put her mug down with a small, careful movement, because her hands weren't entirely steady and she didn't want him to see that. "That's insane," she said. "Yes, you're a king. I know. You can't just kneel on someone's doorstep indefinitely. I can do whatever I want," he said, and for just a moment the old Calum was there, the certainty, the total unself-conscious authority, but it didn't land the way it used to. It landed softer. Because underneath it was something that hadn't been there before, or hadn't been visible before. Something that looked remarkably like desperation dressed in the only clothes it knew how to wear. She looked at him for a long time. He looked back. She thought about the last 3 years. She thought about the specific quality of silence in the first apartment she'd moved into after leaving, how it had been so loud it kept her awake. She thought about the 6 months of crying in the shower and the 6 months after that of being furious and the year after that of building something piece by piece and the slow, difficult process of becoming someone who didn't need rescuing, who had built herself a life that fit, who had learned to be okay. She thought about all of that, and she thought about how none of it had actually fixed the thing underneath it, the specific absence that had taken up permanent residence in her chest, the shape of which was exactly and precisely him. "This doesn't fix it," she said. "I know. You can't just show up and kneel in the rain and expect everything to be I don't expect anything," he said. His voice was very quiet now. I came here because you deserved the truth. Because I should have found a way to give it to you long before now. Because whatever happens next is yours to decide." She looked at him. "And if I decide you should leave?" "Then I leave," he said. He didn't look away. She believed him. That was the thing. She looked at him and she believed him completely, which was either wisdom or its opposite, and she wasn't sure yet which. She picked her mug back up, took a sip of tea that was still too hot. "You'll need dry clothes," she said. Her voice was neutral, careful, giving nothing away except the fact of the words themselves. Something moved through his face. "I have some from when I lived here," she said, which wasn't quite accurate. She'd brought very little of her old life with her. But there was a box under her bed with things she'd never unpacked, things she'd told herself she kept for no reason, things she was only now admitting had been kept for precisely this kind of impossible reason. She stood up, went to the bedroom, crouched down and pulled the box out and found what she was looking for without letting herself look at anything else inside it. She came back and set the folded shirt and trousers on the table. He looked at them. Then, at her. She sat back down and picked up her mug again and looked out the window. "You can change in the bathroom," she said. He didn't move immediately. She could feel him looking at her. "Rosie," he said. "Don't," she said quietly. "Not yet. I'm not ready for whatever you're going to say next. Just give me a minute." He was quiet. The rain fell. She sat with her tea and her window, and the very careful, very fragile thing she was holding together inside her chest, and she gave herself the minute. He came back from the bathroom in the dry clothes. The shirt was slightly too small across the shoulders, which was a detail she noted without meaning to and then couldn't unnotice. He looked different in her things. Closer to human. Less like the version of him that existed in formal spaces, behind thrones and council tables and the machinery of power. More like the version she had known first, before all of that, before she'd understood fully what he was. She had moved to the sofa while he was gone. She'd tucked herself into the far corner of it, with her legs pulled up, and her tea in her lap, and she'd spent the 4 minutes he was in the bathroom having a very direct and unsentimental conversation with herself about what she was doing. The answer, as best she could determine, was that she didn't know. Which was not a satisfying answer, but was at least an honest one. He came and sat in the armchair across from her. He sat the way he always sat, straight-backed, present, like a man who had never in his life needed to slouch. But his elbows were on his knees. That was new. That was something she hadn't seen before, like the formality of him had developed a small leak. "Tell me about this place," he said. She looked at him. "Why?" "Because you built it," he said. "Because I want to understand the 3 years I wasn't here for." It was such a strange thing to say. So plainly, so openly, without any of the guarding she'd expected. She'd expected him to defend himself more, to argue his case, to be the version of him that won rooms by entering them. Instead, he was sitting in her too small armchair with her clothes on and asking about her life. It disarmed her in a way she hadn't been prepared for. "It's small," she said finally. "Yes, I like it that way," after she paused. "After everything. I didn't want a lot of space to fill. I wanted something manageable." He nodded. He was listening in the way he sometimes listened, with his whole attention, which had always been one of the most unnerving things about him, the specific quality of being seen by someone who was actually looking. "I got the job about 6 weeks after I moved here," she continued, without fully deciding to continue. "It's administrative work, mostly, for a small clinic. It's not glamorous. Do you like it?" "I'm good at it," she said, which is different, but it helps. He was quiet for a moment. "And friends?" he asked. She studied him. He wasn't asking to be polite. She could tell from the way he asked it, careful and direct. "Yes," she said. "A few. They don't know very much about where I came from." "Because you didn't want to tell them?" "Because telling people where I came from required telling them why I left," she said. He absorbed that. "They're not wrong to trust you," he said quietly. "I didn't say they were. I know. I just wanted to say it." She looked at him for a long moment. She was trying to reconcile the man in front of her with the man who had stood in front of a court 3 years ago and spoken words that had rearranged the entire geography of her life. They had the same face, the same hands, the same quality of stillness that had always made her feel simultaneously safer and more exposed than anywhere else on Earth. But there was something different. Something in the way he held himself, like a man who had been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and had finally put it down, not because the weight was gone, but because he'd decided to put it down. She used to think, in the early months, that if she ever saw him again, she would be cold. She had planned on cold. She had practiced cold in the mirror more than once. The composed, untouchable version of herself that had nothing to say to him, nothing to offer, nothing to give. She looked at him now, and she felt many things, none of which were cold. She felt the 3 years of distance and the specific way it had reshaped her. She felt the anger that had been living in her chest so long, it had become something quieter, not extinguished but banked, the way coals go quiet but don't go out. She felt the thread of something underneath all of that, stubborn and inconvenient and entirely outside her control. The thing she had built 3 years and a whole city around trying not to feel. She set her mug down on the coffee table. "When you came here tonight," she said carefully, "what were you hoping for?" He was quiet for a long moment, long enough that she could tell he was being honest with himself before answering, which was something she had always both respected and found slightly maddening about him. "I was hoping you would let me explain," he said. "I wasn't hoping for more than that. I didn't think I had the right to hope for more than that. And now?" She watched his jaw shift. "Now," he said, "I'm hoping that you'll let me stay, not forever, not with any particular expectation. Just tonight, long enough for you to finish being angry, if you need to be angry, long enough for the rain to stop." She looked at him. "That's a lot of qualifications," she said. "I'm trying not to presume," he said. "That might be the most un-Calum Ashford sentence you've ever said," she said. He almost smiled, not quite, but almost. "I've been practicing," he said. She stared at him. Something in her chest did a slow, treacherous thing. She looked at the window. The rain was still coming down steadily. The city was dark and wet outside, and in here the lamp was on and the tea was warm, and there was a man in her armchair who had knelt in the rain outside her door, and who was looking at her with an expression she was only just beginning to understand the full weight of. "You can stay," she said. Her voice was very quiet. "On the sofa." "The blanket's in the cupboard by the bathroom." He nodded once. She uncurled herself from the sofa. She was going to bed, and she was going to lie there in the dark and sort through everything that was happening inside her, and she was absolutely not going to think about the fact that he was just through the wall, and that he had come here and knelt in the rain, and that nothing felt the way she had planned it would feel. She was at the door of her bedroom. "Calum," she said. She didn't turn around. "I'm glad you told me," she said. The why, a pause. "So am I," he said. She went to bed. She did not sleep for quite some time. She woke before dawn to a silence that felt different. The rain had stopped. The city outside her window had that particular hush that only happens in the hours before morning properly begins, when the night shift has finished and the day shift hasn't started and the whole world is briefly, perfectly between things. She lay still for a moment, looking at the ceiling. Then she got up. She moved quietly through the bedroom, through the small hallway, and stopped at the entrance to the living room. He was not on the sofa. He was awake. He was sitting by the window in the armchair he'd occupied earlier, and the lamp was off, and the city's pre-dawn gray was coming in through the glass, and he was just sitting there in the near dark, very still, looking out. She leaned against the doorframe and watched him. He turned before she said anything. She'd forgotten that about him, that quality of awareness, the way he always seemed to know when she was in the same room, even before she made a sound. They looked at each other across the gray light. "You didn't sleep," she said. "Not much," he admitted. She came into the room. Sat on the sofa, not the far end this time, somewhere closer to the middle. "What were you thinking about?" He turned back to the window. His profile against the glass was familiar to her in a way that still made something ache. 3 years had not changed the architecture of his face. It had added something to his expression, something older, something that hadn't been there before. But the face itself was exactly as she remembered. "I was thinking about the morning after the announcement," he said. "After the court. After you left." She was quiet. "I walked back to my chambers, and I sat down, and I tried to tell myself it was the right decision," he continued. "That protecting you mattered more than having you. That you would find your way, that the distance would make it better eventually. Did it work?" He turned to look at her. "No," he said. She looked at her hands. "I was so angry," she said quietly, "not immediately. Immediately I was just." She paused. "I didn't know what I was immediately. But after, when I understood what had happened, I was so angry. For months." "I know," he said. "I'm sorry you were." She shook her head. "Don't be sorry I was angry. Be sorry you gave me reason to be." "Yes," he said simply. "You're right." She pulled the blanket around her shoulders. Not his. She'd brought out a different one from the bedroom. Hers, which was a distinction she was aware she was making. "I kept thinking," she said, "that there was something I'd missed, that I'd read it wrong somehow. Because it didn't feel like rejection. Even as it was happening, even as you were saying the words, it didn't feel like you actually meant them. And that was somehow worse, because it meant I couldn't trust my own perception of things." He made a sound she'd only ever heard from him once or twice before, quiet and low and pained. Not a word. Just a sound. "You didn't read it wrong," he said. "I meant none of it. Every word was a lie I had to calculate very carefully. And you were standing right there, and I had to say it anyway." She looked at him. "That sounds like it was very hard for you." Her voice was not entirely without edge when she said it. "Yes," he said, and he didn't flinch from the edge. "It was. And it doesn't matter that it was hard for me. I want to be clear about that. What it cost me is not the part of this story that matters." She studied him. "You've changed," she said. He looked at her carefully. "Some things," he said. "Not everything." "What things?" He was quiet for a moment. "I spent a long time thinking I understood how to make decisions," he said. "Calculating outcomes, protecting things from a distance. I was good at it. I'd been trained to be good at it since I was 16 years old, and I applied that thinking to you, to the bond. And I was completely, catastrophically wrong." He paused. "I'm not sure you can fully understand something like that until it's too late to fix the immediate damage. The understanding arrives after. And then you have to live with the gap between when you should have known better and when you did." She sat with that for a moment. "Do you know," she said, "that the hardest part wasn't even the rejection. It was after, when I had to build something new. When I kept catching myself trying to build something new and then finding that every version of new I could imagine still had a shape like yours somewhere in the middle of it." She shook her head slightly. I was so angry at myself for that. You shouldn't have been. I know that now. I didn't then. The light outside was beginning to shift, almost imperceptibly. Not dawn yet, but the suggestion of dawn. The darkness going from black to something that wasn't quite gray, the particular quality of night relaxing its hold. He leaned forward slightly in his chair. Can I ask you something? She looked at him. The life you've built here, he said. The one that suits you. The job and the friends and the plants you've managed to keep alive. He glanced at the windowsill. I need to know something. She waited. Is there someone, he said, who has that shape in it now? Someone new? She looked at him for a long moment. No, she said. His breath released slowly. I didn't, she continued, for lack of a better word, let anyone close enough. I was very aware that was a choice I was making. I'm not sure I was entirely honest with myself about why. He looked at her. I think you were honest, he said softly. She looked at the window. The city was beginning to exist again outside the glass, the sounds of it returning, early traffic, a door somewhere, the ordinary machinery of a day beginning. The thing was, she said, and she surprised herself by saying it, I was doing all right. I want you to know that. I wasn't waiting. I wasn't pining. I was genuinely, actually, most days, all right. He nodded. I believe you, he said. And then you showed up on my doorstep, she said. Yes, he said. And now I'm sitting on my sofa at 5 a.m. talking to you. Yes, she looked at him. He looked back. And there was something in it now, in the space between them, that hadn't been there before. Not resolution, not forgiveness, nothing that clean or that easy. But something. A new kind of silence that was less like absence and more like two people standing at the edge of something, and both knowing it. I'm not forgiving you today, she said clearly. I know. I need more than one conversation. I know, and I'm not coming back with you. Not yet. Not without understanding what that would look like. On my terms. He looked at her, and the expression on his face was so precisely what she'd needed to see that she had to look away for a moment. On your terms, he said. That's the only terms I'm interested in. She stood up. Went to the kitchen. I'm going to make breakfast, she said. Are you going to stay? She didn't look at him when she said it. Yes, he said. She took eggs from the fridge. She took bread from the counter. She focused on the pan and the stove and the entirely ordinary act of making something from available ingredients. He came and stood at the kitchen entrance. Not in the way, just present. Can I do something? She handed him the bread. Toast, she said. He took it. They moved around each other in her small kitchen, careful and quiet, in the early gray morning, with the rain stopped and the city restarting and everything still unresolved and, somehow, precisely because of that, entirely real. She had thought, once the sun was fully up and the breakfast things were washed and the tea was fresh and the apartment was full of ordinary daylight, that it would feel different. That whatever strange intimacy the dark and the rain had created would dissolve in the brightness and leave two people who were essentially strangers sitting at a small kitchen table with nothing but old history and recent honesty between them. It didn't dissolve. If anything, it settled, like something that had been suspended in uncertain air finally finding its level. They had moved back to the living room. He was in the armchair again. She was on the sofa, the middle this time, without the blanket. The sun was coming through the window and making rectangles of light on the floor, and she had her second cup of tea and he had coffee, and they were in the middle of the kind of conversation that doesn't announce itself as significant but is, in the way that the most important conversations almost never announce themselves at all. She had been telling him about the clinic, about the work she did there, about her colleague who was magnificently terrible at filing but had excellent instincts for people and made everything more interesting. She was not sure why she was telling him this. except that he was listening, and it had been a long time since someone listened to her the way he listened, with the full weight of his attention, like nothing else existed. He told her, in return, small things, not the large ones, not yet. The small ones, about the provinces, about what had changed, about his attendant Lewis, who was apparently still working for him, and had apparently said, upon hearing Calum's intention to come here, only, finally, with such profound exhaustion that it had been, Calum said, both gratifying and slightly mortifying. She laughed at that, a real laugh, unexpected and brief, and she saw his face change when she laughed, something in it opening, the way a window opens, and she looked away before she said something she wasn't ready to say. "Tell me about the council," she said. "The ones who threatened you." He settled back slightly, not reluctant. Composing, "There were 7, he said again. 3 who had the authority to challenge the bond. The other 4 were aligned with them politically. When I told you publicly there was no bond, I bought myself time. But they didn't stop watching. They continued to monitor every move I made, every decision, every piece of correspondence. How long did it take you to start removing them?" He paused. 18 months, he said. She stared at him. "That's an entire 1.5 years of doing nothing." "No," he said, "not nothing. 18 months of building the legal and political groundwork that would make removal permanent and uncontestable. If I'd moved faster, and they'd been able to reverse it, everything I'd done to protect you would have been undone." She thought about that. "And the other 18 months after? After they were removed?" He was quiet. "Finding you took 8 months, he said. The last 10 were spent on the second set, the 4 aligned with them. They were more subtle, more dangerous in some ways." She looked at him. "You spent 3 years, she said slowly, "systematically dismantling the exact people who made what happened to us happen." He met her eyes. Yes, she turned this over carefully in her mind. "And you did it alone? You didn't tell anyone what you were doing or why?" "There was no one I entirely trusted with it," he said. "The bond wasn't widely known, and I needed to keep it that way until I could be sure that coming to you wouldn't put you at risk." "You were protecting me for 3 years, she said. "Alone, trying to," he said, "and failing to reach you sooner than this. Both things are true." She sat with that for a long time. She sat with the specific complexity of it, the grief of what had been lost, and the 3 years of silence and the reason for it, all at once, all true simultaneously. Nothing about it was simple. Nothing resolved into a clean narrative. It was messy and painful and real in the way that real things always were. She had spent 3 years constructing a story about what had happened, the story she'd needed to survive. In that story, he had made a choice that excluded her. A choice about power and politics and what mattered more, and she hadn't mattered more. That story was not entirely wrong, she realized. It was also not entirely right. The truth was larger and worse and more complicated, and somehow the largeness and the complication of it made it more bearable to hold, not less. Because it meant she hadn't imagined it. She hadn't been wrong to trust what she'd felt. She hadn't built something from nothing and believed in something that wasn't real. It was real, she said, almost to herself. He looked at her. "The bond," she said. "It was real. I knew it was real, and then I spent 3 years telling myself I'd been wrong to know it. It was real," he said quietly. "It is real." She looked up. "Is," she said. He held her gaze. "I haven't gone anywhere," he said. The thing in her chest that she had been managing so carefully for 3 years did something it wasn't supposed to do. It moved. Not gone. Not removed. Just shifted. Rearranged into something that hurt less and mattered more, and was deeply, fundamentally inconvenient to everything she'd built. She stood up. She went to the window and stood looking out at the street, which was ordinary and sunlit and entirely unequal to the moment. "I need to think," she said. "I know," he said. He didn't move. "I need you to understand that I'm not saying yes to anything today," she said. "Or to anything specific. I'm not agreeing to come back. I'm not agreeing to pretend 3 years didn't happen. I understand. I have a life here," she said. "That matters. What I've built matters. You don't get to just arrive and have everything rearrange itself around you." "No," he agreed. "I don't." She turned around. He was still in the armchair, still watching her, still, somehow, entirely without the expectation she'd braced herself for, without the pressure she'd expected from a man who was used to having the world accommodate itself to his needs. She looked at him. "Why didn't you just make me come back?" she said. 3 years ago, or 6 months ago when you'd found me, you had the means. You could have made it politically and legally impossible for me to refuse." "Yes," he said, "but you didn't." "No, why? Because you would have come back," he said, "and you would have hated me for it, and I would rather you stay away and be free than come back and be caged." She stared at him. He looked back, steady and undefended. She thought about that. She thought about the particular quality of what he'd just said, the specific shape of it. She thought about how it would have been easy, the other way, how it would have been so simple for him to use what he was, what he had, to just solve the problem of her absence the way men like him solved most problems, by force of will and position. And he hadn't. She sat back down on the sofa. "You're staying tonight too," she said. His expression shifted. "If that's what you want," he said carefully. "It's what I want," she said. And then, because she was not going to be someone who said things halfway, she added, "I don't know yet what I want beyond tonight, but I know that much." He nodded. "That's enough," he said. She looked at him. "It won't always be," she said. "I know," he said. And he was almost smiling again, that almost smile that was doing something to her that she wasn't going to narrate right now. She looked back at the window. The street outside was warm with autumn sun and entirely ordinary and somehow, from inside this room, exactly enough. She went to work on Monday. Because that was what she did. Because she had a life here, and it did not pause for the arrival of rain-soaked kings, and because honestly the normalcy of it was something she needed very badly. He stayed at her apartment. They had discussed, on Sunday evening, what that meant with the careful practicality of 2 people who were both trying very hard not to assume anything. He would stay. He wouldn't follow her to work or appear unannounced anywhere, or insert himself into the parts of her life that weren't ready for him. He would simply be there when she came home. She had stood in the clinic car park that Monday morning and stared at her phone for 3 minutes before going in. She did not text him. She went in. Her colleague, who was magnificent at reading people and who noticed everything, looked at her within 30 seconds of her arrival, tilted his head and said, "Something happened." She opened her computer and said, "Nothing happened." He sat on the edge of her desk and looked at her. "Something definitely happened," he said. She said nothing. He said, "Is this a good something? Or a bad something?" She typed the first line of her morning report. "I don't know yet," she said honestly. He looked at her for another long moment and then nodded, satisfied. "Okay," he said, and went back to his own desk. That was one of the things she appreciated most about her life here. The people in it knew how to leave space. She got through the day. It took more effort than usual. Her attention kept sliding off the work and landing somewhere she brought it firmly back from, which was productive in the sense that the deliberate act of not thinking about something requires such sustained focus that you effectively accomplish everything else in front of you without really noticing. She came home to find that he had cleaned her kitchen, not in a dramatic or intrusive way. The dishes that had accumulated over the week were done. The counter was clear. There was something on the stove that smelled like it had been cooking for some time. She stood in the kitchen doorway. He was reading one of her books in the armchair. He looked up when she came in. She tried to read his face for any sign of the performance of domesticity, of a man deliberately staging a scene, and didn't find it. He had simply been in her space and had done what he did in any space, applied himself to what was in front of him. "You cooked," she said. "I found things," he said. "I wasn't sure if it was allowed." "It's allowed," she said. Her voice was odd. She cleared her throat. She changed out of her work clothes. She came back and sat at the table, and he served whatever he'd made without ceremony, a proper meal, the kind she hadn't made for herself in weeks, and they ate together at her small table in the early evening light. "Tell me about today," she said. He told her. Small things. He had walked the neighborhood in the afternoon, which he described with the faintly bewildered tone of a man encountering ordinary urban life at close quarters. He had found a bookshop 2 streets over, and had come back with 3 books, 2 of which were from the history section, and one of which, she noticed, was a novel she'd mentioned once, long ago, in a different life. She looked at the novel. "You remembered that," she said. He didn't say anything, just looked at her with that steady look. She picked it up and put it on the shelf with her other books. "I went to work today," she said, "and my colleague could tell something had happened just by looking at me. Is your colleague usually correct about these things?" "Almost always," she said. "It's irritating." He was quiet for a moment. "Are you going to tell him?" She considered this. "I don't know what I would tell him," she said. He looked at her. "What would be true?" He said. She thought about it. "That someone from before I came here showed up," she said. "Someone I thought I was finished with, that it turns out I'm not finished with it." He was quiet. "That sounds accurate," he said carefully. "It's not the whole story." "No," he agreed, "but it's not wrong." She looked at her plate. He asked her, after a while, about the city, where she'd found her apartment, what she'd thought when she first arrived, whether she'd been afraid. She'd been terrified, she told him, not of the city, of the quiet, of having all that space in her days with no structure to fill it, coming from a life that had been full of structure, full of other people's needs and schedules and the specific dense energy of a pack. "How did you manage?" he asked. "I made lists," she said, and almost laughed. "I know that sounds ridiculous, but I made lists of everything I needed to do each day, and I did everything on the lists, and then I made new lists. And eventually the lists started to feel less like survival and more like living." He was looking at her with that quality of attention again. "What?" she said. "I missed all of it," he said quietly. "Every version of you between then and now." She looked at him. "The version that cried in the shower," she said. "You missed that too?" "Yes," he said. "That's a strange thing to want to have been present for." "No," he said. "It's not. Not if you were the cause of it." She looked at him for a long time. He didn't look away. She stood up and started clearing the plates. He stood up too, and took them from her and washed them, and she dried them, and they moved around each other in her kitchen in the kind of mundane, easy rhythm that takes most people months or years to find, that strange domestic fluency that either exists between 2 people or doesn't, and she'd forgotten that it existed between them. After, she sat back on the sofa. He sat in the armchair. They didn't talk for a while, just existed in the same room with the lamp on and the city going about its business outside, and the particular inhabited silence of two people who are comfortable enough in each other's presence to not need to fill it. After some time, she said, "I want to ask you something." He looked up from the book. "If I said I needed 6 months," she said carefully, "before anything changed, before I made any decisions about what comes next. If I said I needed to keep living here and working here and you needed to go back to your kingdom and your provinces and your dismantled council and whatever comes with all of that, and we just talked on the phone, or wrote to each other, or whatever, without it being anything more than that, would you do that?" He was looking at her. "Yes," he said. "Without asking when it will change?" "Yes, without pressure?" "Yes." She studied him. "Why?" "Because," he said, "whatever you need to feel safe is something I am willing to do, and because 6 months of letters and phone calls with you is infinitely preferable to 6 months or 6 years of absence." She looked at the window. "You're making this very difficult," she said. "I know," he said, and there was something in his voice that she finally recognized as the closest thing to joy she had heard from him since he arrived, something warm and wry and quietly certain. "You're not going to make it easier?" "No," he said. "I think I've caused you enough difficulty that a little inconvenient sincerity is the minimum I owe you." She almost smiled. Almost she got up and went to the bookshelf and took down the novel he had bought. "I'm going to read," she said. He picked up his book. They sat together in the lamplight and read, and the city went dark outside the window, and it was quiet. 3 weeks passed. He went back. She stood on the pavement outside her building, and they stood across from each other in the ordinary autumn street with its ordinary autumn light, and she found that she didn't know what to do with her hands. Which was not a problem she usually had. She was a person who knew what to do with her hands. He wasn't touching her. He hadn't touched her beyond that first brush of fingers over the towel, not once in 3 days and 2 nights of being in the same small apartment. She had noticed this. She had noticed it with the precision of someone who was trying very hard not to notice it, which meant she had noticed it constantly. "Take care of the plants," he said. "That's what you're leading with?" She said. "You have a tendency to forget the one on the right," he said. "I noticed it looks slightly neglected." She stared at him. "I've had things on my mind," she said. "I know," he said. Still, she looked at him. There was something in his face that she was only just beginning to allow herself to read clearly, or perhaps was only just beginning to be willing to see. "I'll call you," she said. "Please," he said. "Not tomorrow," she said. "I need to think for a few days." "I know," he said. She looked at him. He looked back. She crossed the pavement and stood in front of him, and he went completely still, with that quality of stillness that was specifically him, that quality of making himself entirely available to whatever came next without leaning toward it, without pushing, without anything except presence. She stood on her toes and pressed her mouth very briefly to the corner of his jaw. Then she stepped back. Then she went inside. She closed the door and stood with her back against it for a long moment. Then she went to the kitchen and watered the plant on the right. She called him on a Thursday, 11 days later. She had been going to call sooner. She had not called sooner for reasons that did not hold up particularly well under examination. He answered on the second ring. They talked for 2 hours, not about the important things, about ordinary things, about Lewis having apparently reorganized the entire administrative filing system in Calum's absence into something that was objectively better, but that Calum found slightly impertinent. About her colleague's theory that the clinic's difficult patient was actually a retired professor who was performing belligerence as a coping mechanism. About the history book Calum had been reading, which was about a particular period she hadn't studied, and the argument they had about its interpretation that was genuinely a real argument about facts, and not an argument about anything else at all. When they finally hung up, it was past midnight, and she was lying on her sofa staring at the ceiling with the phone on her chest. She called him the following Sunday. The Sunday after that, he called her. After a month, they were talking 3 or 4 times a week. Then more. The conversations got longer and then shorter again, but more frequent, the way a relationship restructures itself around availability and habit. She told him about the plant, which was thriving. He told her about the council, the new appointments, the slow machinery of restructuring a court. She told him about the novel she'd started writing, which was a thing she had been doing quietly for 2 years and had told no one. He told her about a treaty he was managing with the eastern border, the complexity of it, the way certain historic grievances made good solutions politically impossible. They argued about governance twice. Once he was right, and she eventually said so. Once she was right, and he eventually said so. She noticed he said so directly and without qualifications, which she appreciated. Her colleague, who had been watching her with interest since the Monday morning, finally said, "You seem different." She looked up from her keyboard. "Different how?" He considered. "More here," he said. "Like you were slightly absent before and now you're not." She thought about this. "I think I've been mostly here," she said. "No," he said. "You've been present and competent and good company, but there was always this sense of someone keeping something in reserve." He shrugged. "Not my business. I'm just noting the change." She sat with that. At dinner that evening, talking to Calum on the phone while she cooked, she told him what her colleague had said. Calum was quiet for a moment. "He's not wrong," he said. She stirred the pan. "I thought I was all here," she said. "You were," he said. "And you were also somewhere else at the same time." She turned the heat down. "Is this one of those things where you're going to be uncomfortably accurate and I'm going to have to admit it?" "Yes," he said. She sighed. "Tell me then," he told her, not harshly, not triumphantly, the way he told her most things now, plainly and without performance. He told her that she had built herself a good life and that the goodness of it was real, but that some part of her had kept herself at a slight remove from it, not because she didn't value it, but because she had been half in it and half somewhere she couldn't go back to. And that he thought, since he'd arrived, that particular split had been healing, because the thing she'd been half pointed toward was now accessible again, was something she could choose or not choose, and the being able to choose it made it possible to be fully present everywhere else. She listened to this. "That's very well observed," she said. "I've had time to think about it," he said. She set her spoon down. "I think," she said carefully, "I'm ready to talk about what comes next." A pause. "What brought this on?" he said. Not challenging, just asking. "Honestly," she said, "the thing about being more here, I want to be fully here, in every version of here that I choose, and I think I've been not choosing. I've just been existing in a kind of waiting room, waiting to see whether you were real and whether I could trust this and whether I was going to come apart again." "And?" he said. "You're real," she said. "I can trust this, and I haven't come apart." She could hear his exhale, slow and quiet and entirely unguarded. "Rosie," he said, "don't say anything sentimental right now," she said. "I'm cooking dinner and I'll cry into the pan." A pause. Then something that might have been a laugh but that had been too carefully contained to confirm. "What do you want?" he said instead. "I want," she said, "to come there. Not immediately, not permanently, not without conditions and discussions and a lot of conversations we haven't had yet, but I want to come and see it, see what it looks like, see what I think." "Yes," he said, and the word was so simple and so unelaborated and so complete. Not for a few weeks yet, she said. I know. And I'm bringing my own accommodation. I'm not staying in your chambers or wherever until we've established significantly more ground rules. Understood. And Lewis has to be warned that I'll probably reorganize something. She heard him almost smile. She had learned to hear that over the phone. He'll be delighted, Calum said. He's been reorganizing for decades with no one to appreciate it. You'll have an ally immediately. She picked up her spoon again. Good, she said. She ate her dinner. They kept talking for another hour, about nothing particularly important, about everything, in the way that talking about nothing is sometimes exactly the same thing as talking about everything. She told her colleague on a Wednesday. She didn't plan it as a Wednesday thing. It happened to be Wednesday. She'd been sitting across from him at lunch and he'd been talking about something and she'd been half listening, and then she found herself saying, "I've been talking to someone." He stopped talking. He looked at her with the expression of a man who had been waiting for this specific sentence for several months. "Talking to," he said carefully. Or, "talking to." The second one, she said. He set down his fork. "Tell me," he said. She told him. Not all of it. The parts that were hers to tell. She told him about the person who had arrived at her door in the rain, about the 3 years, about what she was doing now, about the trip she was planning at the end of the month. He listened with the full engaged attention that was his great gift as a human being, the thing that made him good at his work and good as a friend. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Are you scared?" he said. "Yes," she said honestly. "Is it the good kind or the bad kind?" She thought about this. "Both," she said, "but mostly good, I think. The bad kind is just the kind you get when something matters. It doesn't mean it's wrong." He nodded slowly. "And this person," he said, "the one who showed up in the rain, do you trust him?" She looked at the table. "Yes," she said. "More than I expected to. More than I strictly decided to." It happened before I noticed it was happening. Her colleague smiled, a genuine, warm, uncomplicated smile. "That's usually how it works," he said. She rolled her eyes slightly. "Very helpful," she said. "Thank you." "I mean it," he said. "The things you decide are fine. But the things that happen before you notice are usually the ones that matter." She looked at him. "When did you get wise?" she said. "I've always been wise," he said. "You just haven't been listening properly until now." She laughed. They finished their lunch. She drove home from work thinking about what he'd said, about the things that happen before you notice. She thought about the first time she had understood, clearly and without room for argument, that Calum was her mate. It hadn't been a dramatic moment. It hadn't been announced. She had just been standing in a corridor 3 years ago and he had walked past and something inside her had shifted, the way a compass needle shifts when it finds north, quietly and completely and with absolute certainty, and she had thought, oh, and then everything had followed from that. She had spent 3 years trying to argue that moment out of existence. She had told herself she'd been naive, that she'd misread it, that the certainty had been a story she'd told herself rather than a fact. And then he'd shown up on her doorstep, and she had opened the door and the compass needle had shifted again, just exactly the same way, quietly and completely, and she had known that she hadn't invented it. Some things were just true. Even when they were inconvenient, even when you had done your very best to build a life in which they were irrelevant. She packed a bag on a Sunday 2 weeks later. She packed carefully, which was a new habit. She used to pack carelessly, grab things without thinking, trust that whatever she'd forgotten could be dealt with when she arrived. She packed carefully now, methodically, with the particular attention she gave to things that mattered. She packed light. She was only going for 10 days. She had told herself this several times in a row. She stood in the middle of her apartment before she left. She looked at the 2 plants in the window, the books on the shelves, the worn throw on the sofa, all the ordinary material of the life she'd built. She was not leaving it. She was going somewhere and coming back. She was trying something. She was allowing something to be possible. She locked the door. She drove to the station. On the train, she watched the city shrink behind her and the landscape open out into fields and then hills, and then the particular quality of air that meant she was getting closer to a place she had once known very well. She had chosen a train specifically so she could watch this happen gradually rather than arriving suddenly. She had a book in her bag. She didn't read it. He was not meeting her at the station. She had asked him not to. She had wanted to arrive on her own terms, make her own way, establish from the first moment that she was here because she was choosing to be here, not because she had been collected. She found the accommodation, a small cottage in the town that he had arranged through someone else entirely, at her request. She put her bag down. She made tea in the small, unfamiliar kitchen. She stood at the window and looked out at the town, which was familiar in the way places from long ago are familiar. The way something you know by feel rather than by sight feels when you return to it. Not the same, but recognizable. She texted him, "I'm here." He texted back, "I know, take your time." She made tea and drank it standing at the window. Then she changed into different clothes and walked to the gate of his house, which she'd known about for years and had never been to, and stood in front of it for a moment. She pressed the intercom. A voice said, "Yes?" She recognized it. "Louis," she said. "It's Rosie." A pause. Then, very precisely and with the tone of a man who has been waiting a long time to say something, "It's about time," he said. The gate opened. She walked through it. He was in the garden, standing at the far end of it where a path turned toward the house, like he'd been there a while, like he'd come out when he'd heard the gate. His hands were at his sides. He was in ordinary clothes, not the formal things she'd seen him in across years of court functions and political occasions, just ordinary clothes in an ordinary autumn garden with the gray afternoon light around him. She walked toward him. He didn't move toward her. He waited, the way he was learning to wait, with patience that cost him something and offered it anyway. She stopped when she was 2 feet away. "Hi," she said. "Hi," he said. She looked at him. He looked at her. She closed the last distance. He wrapped his arms around her. She pressed her face against his chest and stood there and felt the thing that she had been carrying for 3 years, the specific weight of something unresolved and unfinished and aching. Go still. Not gone. Not dissolved. Still, like a held breath that had finally, at last, been released. His arms were exactly as she remembered. She had thought, privately and without admitting it, that memory was probably unreliable. That the certainty she remembered feeling was something she had constructed retrospectively. That the reality would be ordinary, and the magic of it, if there had been magic, would be revealed as a story she'd told herself rather than a thing that was real. It was real. He was warm and solid and exactly the shape she had been subtracting from herself for 3 years, and she hadn't imagined it, not a single detail of it. She exhaled. He said nothing, just held her. His chin rested against the top of her head, and she could feel his heartbeat, which was slightly faster than the composed exterior might suggest, which she found disproportionately satisfying. After some time, she stepped back. Not all the way, just enough to look at him. "Hello," she said again. Properly, something in his face had changed. Something had opened. She watched it and felt something in her own chest open in response, that involuntary reciprocation that was the particular quality of a bond, the way emotion moved between 2 people like light between mirrors. "You're actually here," he said. He said it quietly, mostly to himself. I'm actually here, she agreed. He looked at her with an expression that was slightly undone, slightly odd, quite unlike the version of him that commanded rooms. She filed this carefully. Lewis says it's about time, she said. Lewis has been saying that for 1.5 years, he said. To me. She raised her eyebrows. I may have mentioned that I intended to come to you several months before I actually did, he said. And Lewis's opinion? Repeated and increasingly pointed, he said. She found herself smiling, a full smile, unreserved. He looked at her smile with the expression of a man who had been cold for a very long time and had just found warmth. Come inside, he said. She came inside. The house was larger than she'd expected, and warmer than she'd expected, and smelled like firewood and old books and something else that she couldn't name immediately, but that was specifically him. The particular atmosphere of a space he inhabited. She stood in the hallway and felt the unfamiliarity of it, and also the not strangeness of it. The way a new place can feel like it has a shape that belongs to you even before you've had time to learn it. Lewis appeared from the kitchen. He was an older man, silver-haired, with the bearing of someone who had spent decades managing impossible situations with minimal complaint. He looked at her with sharp, warm eyes. Miss Rosie, he said. Lewis, she said. He looked at her for a moment. There is tea, he said finally, and if you would like, I've made arrangements for dinner which can be ready whenever you require it. He said this last part in the specific register of someone who has been quietly preparing for this particular evening for some time and is not going to draw attention to the fact. Thank you, Lewis, she said. He nodded. Something in his expression, briefly and very slightly, allowed itself to be warm. He withdrew. She and Calum were alone in the hallway. He looked at her. He said, I want to show you something. He took her through the house, not quickly, not as a tour, more as if he was allowing her to arrive in each room at her own pace. It was a strange intimacy, being shown someone's space. Every room told her something. The library was large and used and had the specific disorder of someone who actually read all the books. The study was neat in a way that suggested not tidiness, but organization, everything placed where it was because it was where it should be. The window in the main room faced east, which she noted. She stood in the library doorway and looked at the shelves for a moment. You've read all of these? She said. Most, he said. Not all. Some were my father's. She walked along the shelves and let her fingers trail over the spines. She wasn't looking for anything. She was just being in the room, establishing the texture of it. She pulled out a book, looked at the cover. Put it back. She pulled out another. Opened it. There was writing on the inside cover in a hand she didn't recognize, something in an older script. His grandfather's, he said from the doorway. She looked at the words. I can't read this script, she said. Few people can, he said. I'll translate if you like. She handed it to him. He held it for a moment, reading it. Then he said, quietly, the translation. It was a dedication, a love letter almost, from someone to someone else, written in the front of a book, in a hand that had survived 100 years or more. Not dramatic. Just true. The kind of thing someone writes when they want to say something that will last longer than the moment. She looked at him. That's beautiful, she said. Yes, he said. He closed the book and put it carefully back on the shelf. She looked at the shelves for another moment. I want to read, she said. While I'm here. I want to come in here and read and not be anywhere in particular. Is that all right? Everything in this house is yours to use however you choose, he said. She looked at him. Don't say things like that, she said. Why? Because they make it very difficult to maintain the reasonable measured pace I've set for all of this. He looked at her with that almost smile. I apologize, he said, without sounding in the least apologetic. She shook her head slightly. She walked past him out of the library, and he followed her, and they went to find the tea Lewis had made. They sat together that evening in the main room with the fire going and the dark outside, and the dinner Lewis had prepared between them on the table. They talked easily, the way they had learned to talk over weeks of phone calls, with the particular fluency of two people who have been getting to know each other in the dark and are now doing it in the light. She told him about packing, about standing in her apartment, about what she'd felt on the train watching the city shrink behind her. He told her about the last 2 months, about the appointments he'd made to the council, about a project in the northern province that had been running for years and was finally yielding what it had promised, about the autumn, which was unusually quiet after a long, complicated summer. After dinner, she helped Lewis clear, which he seemed mildly surprised by and then accepted without comment. Late in the evening, she sat on the window seat in the main room and looked out at the garden in the dark. He was in the chair across from her, reading. She was aware of him in the room. Not anxiously, just completely, the way you're aware of heat when you've been cold. She said his name. He looked up. She said, "I'm glad I came." He looked at her for a long moment. "So am I," he said. His voice was very quiet. She looked back at the dark garden. "I'm going to sleep," she said. "It's been a long day." She stood. She crossed the room and paused at the door. She looked back. He was watching her. She said, "Good night, Calum." He said, "Good night, Rosie." His voice had something in it she was finished pretending not to recognize. She went to sleep in the room he'd prepared for her, and the house was quiet around her, and she felt, for the first time in 3 years, entirely in the right place. She stayed for 10 days. Then, on the morning of the 11th, she called her colleague and asked for 2 more. He said yes immediately, which told her he'd been expecting the call. She stayed. The days had a texture to them she hadn't anticipated. She had expected the visit to feel like an audition, like 2 people carefully presenting versions of themselves and monitoring each other's responses. Instead, it felt ordinary, genuinely, simply ordinary, in the way that only happens when the performance has been abandoned. She reorganized his filing system on the 5th day. Not entirely. Just one section that was, by any reasonable standard, incorrectly categorized. Lewis appeared in the doorway of the study while she was doing it, assessed the situation, and left without comment. When she'd finished and gone to make tea, she came back to find that Lewis had reorganized 2 adjacent sections using her approach. She did not mention this. Neither did Lewis. It became a quiet, collaborative project that neither of them ever directly acknowledged. Calum watched this unfold with the expression of a man who found everything funnier than he was permitting himself to show. "You're going to completely revolutionize the household systems by the end of the week," he said. "Lewis and I just have compatible instincts," she said. "I have worked with Lewis for 12 years, Calum said. "He has never, once, voluntarily adopted another person's approach to anything." She considered this. "Maybe he was waiting for someone with the correct approach," she said. Calum looked at her. "Maybe," he said. She went to the town on the 7th day, alone, on purpose. She wanted to do it herself, wanted to walk through the streets that were familiar but not, and find out how it felt to be here on her own, outside the context of the house and him. It felt like something she could do. Not like coming home, not exactly, that was not a word she was ready to use, but like a place that could become familiar. Like a place she could learn. She stopped in the bookshop and bought something. She had coffee by herself at a small place she found off the main street. She sat with it and thought about the things she'd told herself for 3 years, and the way they felt now, from inside this moment, from here. She had been right to leave. She had been right to build what she had built. It had not been a mistake, none of it, Not the crying in the shower, or the angry months, or the careful making of lists, or the second-hand furniture, or the colleague who noticed everything, or the plants in the window. All of it had been necessary. All of it had made her the version of herself who had opened the door in the rain and listened instead of closing it, the version who had asked for 6 months and accepted the full weight of what she'd been given, the version who had packed a bag and come here and sat in his library and read his grandfather's words and known they were true. She had not been waiting. She had been becoming. The coffee was good. The street outside was wet with autumn rain, the light kind, the kind that makes everything look like it means something. She paid and walked back. He was in the garden when she returned, talking to Louis about something practical. He looked up when he heard the gate. She walked toward them, and he turned to face her, and his face did what it did. That thing she was finished pretending was not her undoing. "How was it?" he asked. "Good," she said. She showed him the book she'd bought. He took it, looked at the cover, handed it back. "Good choice," he said. She went inside. That evening after dinner, she told him she needed to talk about the practical things, not as a way of introducing difficulty, she said, but because she needed to know what the shape of this could actually look like in the real world, not as a concept, but as a life. He said, "Yes, tell me what you need." She told him. She told him that she wasn't giving up the apartment. Not yet, that she needed to know she could go back, that the having of somewhere else that was hers was not negotiable. "Yes," he said. She told him that the job mattered, that she wanted to continue it, or something like it, that she was not going to become someone who existed only in relation to him. "Yes," he said. She told him that her colleague needed notice, not immediately, but that she would need to give proper notice and not just disappear. "Of course," he said. She told him that she needed to understand what the political landscape looked like now, concretely, not in the abstract, what the remaining council members knew and thought, and what their position on the bond would be. He told her, completely and in detail, not softening anything, not managing her response. He told her where the resistance remained and what form it took, and what his strategy was for managing it. He asked her questions. He listened to her answers. She said several things that were more perceptive than his current approach, and he said so directly, and they argued slightly about one aspect and resolved it. Afterwards, she felt the particular satisfaction of having been taken seriously. "This is what it would be like," she said. He looked at her. "You want to be useful," he said, "not decorative." "I have a very specific skill set," she said. "I have no interest in being a symbol." "Good," he said simply, "because I have no interest in a symbol." She looked at him. "I'm going to test you on that," she said. "I hope you will," he said. She stood. She came to stand in front of him, where he was sitting. She looked at him. He looked up at her and held very still. She put her hand against his jaw the way she had been wanting to for weeks, the way she had not allowed herself to because she'd needed it to mean something when she did it. He turned his face slightly into her hand, the way he had once when she'd done this before, in a previous version of this story. "I'm coming back," she said. "After this. I'll go back and give notice and sort everything out, and then I'll come back." He was not moving. She could feel the deliberate stillness of him, the effort of it. "And after?" He said carefully. "We figure it out together," she said, "on equal terms." "Yes," he said. His voice was not entirely steady. She leaned down and pressed her mouth to his. He kissed her back with 3 years of restraint behind it, and underneath it something that was not restraint at all. Something she had known was there and had been choosing whether to step into, and she stepped into it now, deliberately and completely, and without the reservation she'd carried all the other times. His hands came up to hold her face, gentle and certain, and she sat down beside him, and they stayed there in the quiet of the evening with the fire going and the dark outside and the whole long, difficult distance between the person she'd been when she left and the person she was now collapsed into this single present moment. After some time, she rested her head against his shoulder. He put his arm around her. The fire settled. She thought about the morning she had woken up 3 years ago in a world that had been rearranged overnight. The shape of what she'd lost. The life she'd built from the rubble of it. The particular stubbornness that had carried her through. The refusal to stay in ruins. The choosing to build. She did not regret any of it. Not the hard parts. Not even the worst of the hard parts. She had needed every bit of it to arrive here, exactly herself, with nothing owed and nothing given under duress, choosing freely and with full knowledge and with both eyes open. That's what made it real. She thought about this and felt the truth of it settle over her, warm and quiet and permanent. She was here. She was choosing this. She was her whole self choosing it. Lewis came to the doorway at some point, assessed the room with the expression of a man confirming something he had known for some time, and quietly withdrew. The fire burned. The night went on around them. In her apartment, 2 cities away, the plant on the right was probably fine. She had watered it before she left. She had made sure. She tilted her head up and looked at him. He looked down at her. She said, "I never properly told you what it was like when you said those words in front of the court." He went still. "I know," he said. "You don't have to." "I want to," she said. "Not tonight, but soon. I want you to know, properly." "Yes," he said, "whenever you're ready." She nodded. "And I want you to tell me," she said, "what it was like for you. That morning. That day. After." "Yes," he said. She settled back against his shoulder. "We have time," she said. "We have time," he agreed. The fire burned down and the night deepened, and outside the autumn rain came back softly, and neither of them moved for a very long time. 2 months later, Lewis reorganized the last cabinet in the study. He did not say anything about it. He simply finished the work one afternoon while Rosie was in the library and Calum was in a meeting with the Eastern Province delegate, and by the time anyone noticed, the thing was done, and the system was complete, and there was nothing to discuss because there was no longer any disorder left to correct. Rosie found him in the kitchen afterward and said, "You finished it." Lewis poured 2 cups of tea and handed her one. "It needed doing," he said. She smiled at him. She had been here for 6 weeks now. The apartment was sublet. Her colleague had been given notice, and then, after a long conversation and the discovery that his cousin worked in the Northern Province Clinic, had suggested a visiting position that would allow her to keep working and to travel. This had taken 3 weeks to arrange and had involved a volume of correspondence she had managed personally, which Lewis had observed with what she was fairly certain was approval. She had her own study now. A small room off the library that had been used for storage. She had cleared it with Calum one Saturday morning, both of them carrying boxes through the hallway while Lewis appeared at intervals to judge the efficiency of their system. She had put her desk in front of the window. She had brought her 2 plants. The one on the right was thriving. She was in the garden on a Thursday afternoon, sitting on the bench at the far end with a notebook and the mild autumn sun on her face, when she heard the gate and then his footsteps on the path. She did not look up immediately. She was in the middle of a sentence, and she had learned over time that she was permitted to finish sentences, that he did not expect her to drop everything when he appeared, that he in fact preferred her not to, that the version of her who finished her sentences was one he actively valued. She finished the sentence. She looked up. He was standing at the entrance to the garden looking at her. He was still in his meeting clothes, slightly loosened. He had come straight out, which he did sometimes, this particular quality of needing to be in the same air as her after certain kinds of days. She patted the bench beside her. He sat down. She handed him her notebook. He took it and read the sentence she had just finished. "Good," he said. She took it back. "How was the delegate?" "Long," he said. "Did you resolve the water rights issue?" "Partially," he said. "We'll need another session." She made a note in the margin of her notebook about something else. He sat beside her and she sat beside him, and the garden was quiet around them, and the afternoon light did what autumn light does, turned everything amber and particular and slightly elegiac, the way it does when the year is ending and things are shifting into their winter shape. She thought about the night he had stood in the rain outside her door, the distance it had taken to get here. Not just the 3 years, but the distance after that, the careful months of phone calls and letters, the 10 days in the cottage, the 6 weeks of building something real and inhabitable, the 2 months now of it becoming ordinary. She thought about what ordinary felt like when it was the right kind. Not the kind that deadens, but the kind that grounds. The kind that lets you be fully inside your days rather than watching them from the side. He had fallen slightly asleep in the sun beside her. She could tell from the quality of his stillness, and from the slight change in his breathing, and because she knew, now, the specific way he looked when he was almost asleep, which was one of the unexpected gifts of being close to someone. The particular knowledge of how they look when they're not performing anything at all. She sat beside him and let him sleep for a few minutes in the autumn sun. She looked at the garden, at the gate, at the house beyond it, with the library window lit from inside where she'd left the lamp on. She had walked through that gate on a gray October afternoon and stood in this garden and felt the compass shift, and she had let it shift, and everything since had followed from that. She looked back at her notebook. She wrote another sentence. The words came easily now. Here, in this particular air, in this particular life that was hers and his, and made from the ruins of something that had broken and been rebuilt more carefully the second time. He stirred. She kept writing. He opened his eyes and looked at the sky and then at her. "How long was I out?" he said. 7 minutes, she said. "That was embarrassing," he said. "You have a difficult job," she said. "Still, you were very graceful about it," she said. He looked at her. "Were you watching me sleep?" "I was writing," she said, "and watching me sleep." Incidentally, she said. He sat up properly, ran a hand through his hair. He looked, in this unguarded moment, like someone she loved very much. She turned back to her notebook. "Dinner is at 7, he said. "I know," she said. "Louis is making the thing with the mushrooms." "I know," she said. "I asked him to." He looked at her. "You asked Louis?" "We have an understanding," she said. He shook his head very slightly, in the particular way he did when something pleased him, and he was managing the extent to which he showed it. She wrote the last word of her paragraph. She closed the notebook. She sat for a moment with her face in the thin autumn sun, and her eyes closed, and the warmth of him beside her, and the sound of the garden, and the smell of wood smoke from somewhere nearby. 3 years ago, she thought, I was someone who was learning how to disappear. I was very good at it. I got better every day. And now she was here. In a garden she had learned by walking through it. In a life she had not been handed but had built, carefully and stubbornly, from what she was and what she chose. With a man who had knelt in the rain and been honest about the cost of it, and then waited without certainty for as long as it took. And it was ordinary. That was the thing she hadn't expected. It was ordinary, and it was real, and it was hers. She opened her eyes. He was watching her with the expression she'd been learning the full language of, and she understood it, all of it, without translation. She stood up. She offered him her hand. He took it. They walked back to the house together in the last of the light.